Welcome back, folks. Welcome back. As I said, it's just me today. I wish I had my buddy Omar here because I know we were talking about this specific subject quite a bit of times, especially since the demon stuff and just creatures, weird creatures like that. Have always interested us, and like they can kind of it ties a little bit into the cryptozoology and many other things that for us for the longest time just seemed kind of maybe completely, I don't know, mythological, not true, but there's definitely a spiritual element to these weird things, and there's no better person to talk about this such thing than Judd Burton. Welcome back, Judd Burton. How you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Pretty good, man. Like I said, man, we wanted to have you back on, and you were like, "Hey, let's talk about preternatural morphology," which is hard for me to say, and demonic manifestations. And I was like, "Oh yeah, that'd be great. Let me Google that real quick. What does that mean?" You know what I mean? And so I was kind of like, "What is that?" So for the layman like myself, what are we talking about here when we want to get into that, man?
Yeah, well, per our previous discussion, um, Monsters 101, basically. Maybe
Yeah, yeah, I think that's what I
simple
told you
approach
before.
to Monsters Monsters 101. Yeah,
Mhm.
the preternatural part that's synonymous with the supernatural, and the morphology part is where the demons manifest in, according to folklore.
Hmm.
They've manipulated mythology and folklore and use the respective cultures that they enter into
Who
to take
who has
various forms.
manipulated that? The demons?
Yeah. Hmm.
Uh, huh. So what exactly do you mean by that? Like, how does that look like? Because, um, when you mentioned it at first, I thought maybe you meant because me and Omar, we used to be kind of in a deliverance ministry, right?
Sure.
And when we saw these demonic manifestations in people, we saw definitely people, speaking different languages that they don't originally speak. They were 10 times, a lot more stronger than us. I can tell you that. I mean, I've seen this little bodied girl, tiny little 14-year-old girl just pick me or Omar up with just like with our arms stretched out, which is really difficult.
Right.
Me and him are about 240 pounds each,
Sure.
and so I just that's what I thought of when you said demonic manifestation. But
Sure.
you like, what were you talking about? Because it seems like this goes back to more of the mythological things.
Well, I mean, and the two aren't necessarily mutually exclusive.
Uh,
I've I've also been involved in deliverance ministries in the past, and
mm,
I certainly know about all, and have witnessed many of the things you're talking about. Speaking in languages that they're not trained in, enormous strength.
mm.
Um, some of them even displaying a kind of, almost um, animal-like, savagery in some cases.
So let me ask you this, because I spoke about this a while ago. I just want to see, since you've actually gone into the ancient study of this. This is me. This is just me speculating.
Sure.
Um, some of these spirits that came that embody or manifest themselves in human bodies, just like you
Hmm.
said, some of them took on these very animalistic, um, uh, you know, characteristics. They were growling, their hands curled up like claws. Some of them would even walk very weird, and they would basically
Sure.
crawl, or you could say, uh, you know, that classic pose where werewolves kind of like go down almost to their knees, and then they're about to
Mhm.
jump or something. I've seen a lot of that, and they're just screaming into the air, foaming at the mouth, and I just kind of speculated, like, what kind of spirit is in her? Like, is that like a like because we know that evil spirits are like dead Nephilim spirits, right? The spirits of the Nephilim,
Right.
and that's where we get actually demons from. They're not fallen angels. And if you don't know about that, folks,
Right.
go back to our previous episodes, and we talk about that with Michael Heiser and other folks. And so we know that these are ancient Nephilim um, spirits possessing people. Are some of those spirits because they came from these like animal hybrids? Possibly, is that what it is? Or
Yeah, I think that's, at least that's where I've anchored
hmm,
most of my research on
that
this
is
trajectory
crazy interesting.
is on the basis that, not only not only does the language, in other words, the word Nephilim, not only does it lend itself towards, a very specific kind of, um, humanoid, hominid creature, a
Mm,
giant,
mm.
but there are all these chimera, these human animal hybrids that sort of fall under the umbrella of Nephilim as well.
So
And so,
that being
yeah, I'm
said,
certainly not the first scholar to do that.
really,
I'm picking up. Yeah, well, Montague Summers wrote about it in a couple of sentences, really in one paragraph, in a book he wrote on vampires called "The Vampire: His Kith and Kin."
mm.
And I thought that makes a lot of sense. That to tie that to the pre-flood world, something like a vampire, because the
S-
giants were bloodthirsty and usurping, and that plays out in the sort of religious landscape that they set up for
so,
world societies.
so are you one to lean
There,
on that in the pre-flood world? There was a lot of creatures we consider mythological, like vampires or
yes,
werewolves, to
and
be.
in the post-flood world too.
You consider them to be
Although
real?
seemingly they would be, um, you would have more occurrence of them in the early pre-flood and the antique civilization periods, and then they sort of, um, just in terms of, if we could use a kind of, supernatural demographics, their
Mm.
numbers the sightings of them become sparser and sparser as time goes on.
Hmm.
Um, or it's hard to say. I think in a lot of the cases where we have visual, iconographic, or at least visual memories, of these creatures, like creatures, werewolves, vampires, and ghouls, and things that were very visually striking.
Do you think
I think that those are
maybe
extreme
yeah.
cases,
Uh-huh.
um, that reflect the ability of the pre-flood watchers and the Nephilim to manipulate matter in a number of
Mm,
different ways.
mm, mm. So, okay, because that's kind of like a I've never really said that statement before. So what we're saying is that there's definitely, well, I could say, because I've seen some of your posts that you've done, there's even a lot of, we tend to write off a lot of archaeology as, oh, that's let's put that into this mythos or that myth or whatever. Because I've seen a lot of your posts that you post on Facebook and things like that about people finding archaeological evidence for, vampire type like reptilian creatures or different things like that. And it's just always, I guess, immediately our initial, maybe because of how, maybe it's intentional how we've been taught these things, that we just think, well, yeah, that's a, they used to think stuff like that, but it doesn't mean it's real.
Yeah, a lot of that stems from postmodernism, and the sort of the negative impacts, even before postmodernism, the negative impacts that, um, evolutionary theory had on all the fields, because it didn't just affect biology; it affected economics, it affected history, it affected philosophy, um, and so, we got on this track that somehow societies and civilizations develop in a linear fashion, and there's a kind of mathematics that you can apply to it, to where there's a degree of predictability. Historians flirted with that in the 70s. It was called pleometrics. It was a big mess. They've been trying to do it again, in the last couple of decades, and it's just, you can't, because number one, societies and civilizations don't work like that, nor do ideas. They
Mm.
don't necessarily. necessarily develop in a straight line. You know, there's ebbing and flowing and
Right.
this and that. And so, plus that you add that to postmodernism, and you only undergird the pure materialistic approach to um, reality, basically, or
Right.
nature, even if you wanted to boil it down to that.
Right.
But a purely materialistic or naturalistic approach to reality um, has lots of holes in it. I mean, just it's a philosophy that doesn't hold up to a lot. And you know, if it was strict materialism, then biologists, for instance, wouldn't have to rely more on engineering design now than they do evolutionary biology to understand the mechanics of a cell,
Mm.
because they're having to do that because the implications are, because we can look at a cell at such a microscopic level now, we can see all of the,
It's
you know,
little
little
functions and
pieces working together.
right.
And there's a it, the implication there is that it smacks of design. And if there's a design there, then there's an ultimate designer.
Yeah, yeah. I
And so that's just
remember.
one one way. Um, Without getting too far off the track, that's just one way that the pure materialist approach to reality doesn't really hold up
Right.
um, too well. You know, I mean, people like Richard Dawkins would have you believe that it would, but they're so dogmatically and staunchly married to that approach to reality that um, they can't logically or rationally weigh other opposing uh, perspectives,
Right.
see that they have merit. And
Yeah.
you
No.
know,
Do you remember seeing that Expelled documentary, or did you say Intelligence Not
oh
Allowed?
yeah,
Yeah. That was
yeah,
way ahead of its time. I remember seeing that, and it seemed like that's the first thing I ever saw where I kind of exposed like the systematic like uh cutting off of the intelligent design model. Like they were anyone who touched it in the
yeah,
slightest in the scientific community was just completely shut down, defunded, and it was just like this
oh
whole
yeah.
conspiracy about it. And I was like, what? I didn't even know that. And that's a great documentary, folks, by the way, for those people that are kind of teetering on intelligent design. I mean, it basically explains what you were saying about the cell and just the impossibility of us just coming from evolution, and it just very, very obviously shows that we were designed and down to at the cellular level. You know what I mean? But
Absolutely.
that
Yeah, and
being, oh, sorry.
sad thing about that is that's reflective in all disciplines. That was a movie that's, largely about um, biologists
Mm-hmm.
of one sort or another. There are a few philosophers and cosmologists in there,
Uh-huh.
but they're still thinking along biological lines. And the crazy thing is that most of those people that were interviewed were not really even that invested in the idea of intelligent design. They had just referenced it in their papers or something because of the
Right.
argument that they were making.
Right.
And boy, did they get shut down quickly. I mean, some
Right.
of them were obviously subscribed to the idea of intelligent design, but most of them did not, and it
Mm.
cost them positions at the Smithsonian. It cost them their tenure. Some of them got fired, and this just illustrates the fact that there is no academic freedom in colleges and universities anymore.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the reason is there's no place, there's really no place where trailblazing or breaking through frontiers is so discouraged, ironically, as in the modern university and college.
Mm. Yeah. No. I mean, I absolutely agree. But going back to what we were talking about, do you think is there like extra biblical material that ties to what's in the Bible about what was happening in the pre-flood and even in the post-flood world, as you mentioned? Because when we read Genesis and God bringing the flood, it almost seems a little bit out of nowhere, and maybe if you read other books, maybe like the Book of Enoch, and I hear there's some interesting things in like Jash or Jubilees and things like that, and um, that kind of give a little bit more light on what was going on, why the flood had to happen. It was more than just, oh, people are sinning a lot. You know what I mean? And that's why the flood came about. Uh, you said earlier that the fallen watchers and Nephilim had this ability to distort physical matter. So, do you think
Mm.
during this time we were they just what experimenting on humans, or were they, on themselves, or just, I mean, that they can't create something from scratch because they're not God, but so they're working with humans. It almost reminds me of what people say the Greys are doing these days, where they take people and they're, and most of the accounts is them that they're doing something with them, and they're, you know, um, uh, experimenting on human beings or whatever, and kind of reminds me of that a little bit.
Yeah, and then with the modern abduction phenomenon, there's 9 times out of 10, it seems like that there is a genetic reproductive component, to what's going on, and that's certainly the case in the pre-flood world. Anything under the umbrella of creation seemed to be fair game for the Watchers,
Mm.
in their Genesis 6 experiments. As we mentioned a moment ago, because not only does Nephilim mean giant, it can also mean, these sort of aberrant hybrid, um, chimerical creatures, that included not only human components but also, quadruped, quadrupeds of different kinds, and birds and reptiles and things like that. Um,
I feel like that's where we
and
get the birth of all this. Like, I'm a fan. Have you seen The Witcher? The Witcher on Netflix?
I've actually started that last week. I haven't
Oh,
seen the entire thing. Yeah.
okay. Okay, yeah. So when I watch things like that, and when I watch like Game of Thrones and things like that, I'm my imagination runs wild, and I'm just thinking to myself, like, how much, I wonder just how much of mythology was not just a myth, or how much of these stories is actually true. You know what I mean? I'm curious. I would never say all of it. Obviously, I don't know. I wasn't there, but like, I'm just always curious because it always ties back to, there's this entity they conjure. They have magical powers, and it's like all of this stuff. I'm like, dude, that's like Genesis 6 stuff, man. Like, that was happening like a long time ago, and I'm wondering if this was like the birth of all our mythological movies, and then it's just kind of been, you know, over time just turned into what entertainment. We watch it on Netflix.
Yeah, well, I mean, we certainly we get that in the pre-flood world, and I think even in the early post-flood world stages, the experiment is sort of kicked off again to an extent. But um, myth is one of those words that's completely adulterated and misused in Western languages.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The Greek word muthos means story, and our concept of, the way we view history today and mythology, we view them as these distinct, um, lines of questioning or records. You know, that's not really how people in the ancient world would have viewed history and mythology. There was really no clear line, and even, um, there are numerous examples of mythology containing elements of history. Um, the Sumerian Kings list has Gilgamesh on it. For the longest time, we thought Gilgamesh was simply the first, graphic novel, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Super.
Mm-hmm.
But there are other examples. Uh, Romulus and Remus, the mythological founders of Rome. Romulus is mentioned as the first king in the regal period of Roman history.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
So,
the Trojan War was an actual event that took place, an economic war between the Mycenaean Greeks and the people of West Asia. That's attested to not only in archaeology but in Hittite records.
mhm. it,
See, there's always an element of historicity in mythology, and that's a handful of examples. We could devote volumes worth of episodes
wow.
just to that alone. But it's the way that we've come to view myth on the popular level as just fodder for popular consumption in movies and stuff like that, and rather than an actual potential record for chapters in our past. Um, Mythology within the academic world is basically appreciated for its cultural value, but really not as something that could be, of historical value,
Right.
that represents a collective memory, a social memory of a given culture,
Well,
or cultures. You know,
I think the reason why these hero archetypes for a lot of people, especially men, young men, are like great. Like you watch all these movies where the man is just the hero, the unsuspected hero, the underdog, or all these things. I think the reason they're so we gravitate towards them, it's because uh, we're actually part of that story, and we're not. A lot of people don't even aren't aware that they actually are part of this big story that God has chose you to be in. I believe, well, at least that's how I view it, because like I try to teach the youth when I was teaching at the church I used to go to, and I'm like, isn't it awesome? We're always like, oh, I want to be Atreyu, or I want to be this guy, or I want to, you know what I mean? Like especially when I was a kid, man, I remember watching these movies, and I'm like, I want to be the kid pulling the sword out of the stone. Like I want to be that kid. You know what I mean? And
yeah, we want Luke Skywalker. That's why
right,
we, that's why our parents made Batman and Superman capes for us when we were
right,
little.
exactly,
There's something that resonates because I believe that God created us to be we're hardwired to be that way.
exactly.
Um,
That's what I'm trying to get at. Exactly.
what I tell people, you can go and watch the Justice League or Avengers or Star Wars or whatever,
Yeah.
and they're these epic struggles of good and evil, but you don't have to go to the theater for that. If you're a believer, if you're a follower of Jesus, you're in the middle of it already.
Yes, indeed. Exactly. I think
Um,
if we understood that we're that big of a part of the biblical narrative, we would take it way more serious, and we would be like, whoa, like I gotta
yeah,
wake up, you know?
yeah. I had, my best friend, um, growing up was a huge Star Wars fan. I mean,
Mm.
who's not, right?
Right.
Um,
Yeah, yeah.
but we used to always have these really, deep philosophical discussions about the Jedi Order and the Sith. This is long before even the expanded novels and the prequels and the
Mm.
trilogy and all.
Right.
This was just when there were 3 Star Wars movies,
Oh, nice. You guys
and
were
we
the purists.
yeah, just hours and hours talking about how, there'll come a time when, from amongst believers, the people that are called out, there'll come a time when, um, there will have to be the analog of a Christian Jedi.
Uh-huh.
there'll have to be,
Right.
people devote their lives to these principles, above and beyond, going to church one day a week.
Mhm. Yeah. I try to remind myself of that quite often, because sometimes I guess because we can't see the spiritual realm, we're almost, I don't know, it almost seems unreal. There's this, obviously there's a sense to being able to see uh this epic battle happening around you that would, I don't know, at least in my head would bring some sort of confirmation, but I just know that stuff is all around me. I mean, I know, the Bible says, Satan is around us, walking, you know, around seeking to whom he can devour. Like I mean, it's a real thing, our powers and principalities in high places who we're fighting, right? All these things are just like happening around us. And I remember some of the times where, um, we were doing like demonic, like deliverance. Sorry, when we're doing deliverances, we were praying.
Mhm.
Some of them couldn't, depending on who was praying, or they couldn't open their eyes and look at you directly, like, and they would say that they could see, fire, or they could see a light, or they could see different things, and they're like, no, it hurts, and they would go crazy, like, it burns, and obviously you're not seeing or feeling anything, at least in our perspective, but they're like suffering, and they're like, no, get me out of here. Like at one point, they just didn't even want to be there,
Mhm.
and so you know that there's something happening, and that stuff, like I never forgot it. I kept it with me to really just know that. I mean, it's kind of like Constantine. I don't know if you ever seen Constantine with Keanu Reeves.
Yeah, the DC character, John Constantine.
Yeah,
Yeah, I was just talking about him the other day.
okay. And so I remember I didn't know that there's actually a character until I saw the movie, and then I was like, who is this? And then I looked it up, and then it was amazing to me because there was parts where he was describing like the spiritual world, and it was like this the city would just turn, like slightly fiery or slightly spiritual, like, and then there's like this other side, this other dimension. It was still the city, but it was like completely
Yeah,
spiritual now. You know what I mean? And
yeah,
I just would imagine that that's what it would look like in a sense. I don't know. I have no idea, but that is what's happening in this realm that we are living in now. Uh, there's just so much happening in this other side that we're not aware of,
right.
And then, anyway, sorry, I'm babbling on right here. Yeah, Omar told me, you know what, Chuck, dude, you babble. And he's like, is it you or is the guest gonna talk? I'm like, yeah, my bad. I tend to babble sometimes,
It's your show. It's your show, man.
I know.
Everybody has their own broadcast style.
Yeah, no, I get you. I get you. But so going back to like the werewolves and vampires, that's one of the things that you have a lot of information on. I want to know, a little bit more about them. To be honest, like what's the deal with? Because I know even why you know maybe they're talking about like silver and all this. Like why shoot a werewolf with silver? Or you know what I mean? Like there's all these things that are kind of like tradition. Um,
Hmm.
do those have like any ancient origin, or is that just kind of like a
Yeah,
you know?
yeah. The means of dispatchment, at least the folkloric record for the means of dispatchment of these creatures, can vary somewhat. Um, in the Western world, so many of them are rooted in Christian tradition
Mm,
of one sort, or whether that's Eastern Orthodox Church or Roman Catholic Church or even later Protestant traditions. Um, but the what I'm trying to get people to understand, not only with this preternatural morphology certification that I'm offering, but just by talking about it, and I'm finishing up will hopefully have finished up a book by the time June rolls around that I've been working on for a number of years called the Van Helsing Way,
ooh,
which
that
is about
that
th-
sounds
th-
like I want to buy it
this
already.
this biblical approach to these folkloric creatures.
Mm,
So yeah, the what you're talking about is an apotropaic, and that's a fancy anthropological word for a way to get rid of one of these things.
okay.
If it was Ghostbusters, you'd have a proton pack,
Oh,
kind of a thing.
nice, nice. I think this
Right.
episode is perfect because we just recorded an episode with Ali Siadatan, and
Uh huh.
we talked about how God used martial arts in the Old Testament, you know, to help get rid of the Nephilim. You know what I mean? And I was like, dope, And so now we're gonna add some
That's
of this.
well, that's interesting because that's actually a theory that I've been working on for a number of years.
Oh,
Just the mechanics of on the ground fighting the Nephilim. Yeah,
yeah.
I
Okay.
probably got enough for a book
Ooh.
here within the next couple of years or so. I
Oh,
should probably talk to Ali. We probably need to talk.
yeah, yeah. It's a good. Yeah, yeah. You should reach out to him because that's kind of why he started his own dojo and everything too. You know what I mean? Because it's kind of he believes it's really important to
Oh
know
man, I got
know
to
the
talk.
arts.
Yeah, I think we're friends on Facebook.
Okay.
I need to reach out. Anyway, yeah, an apotropaic would be, for example, um, the use of silver,
Mm.
um, or a crucifix, a cross against a vampire. Now, very clearly, the the cross being the symbolism of not just the crucifixion, but the resurrection of Jesus and his victory over death.
Mm.
And this was the thing that was repugnant to the unclean spirit that
Mm.
comprised the vampire.
Mm.
And there's some other interesting things that I found in terms of like herbal dispatchments. You know, the old it's kind of an extreme herbal, but the stake through the heart. You know, there are various kinds of trees.
Yeah.
You know, like the white thorn and the poplar tree, for instance, was favored in a number of places in Eastern Europe, and um, the reason that they used this is because, according to one tradition, the poplar was the wood that the cross was made out of, that Jesus was crucified on, and so its name actually came from uh, the Latin name is something like Popula tremulus or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
because it. You ever seen like a poplar or like an aspen? Aspen is a poplar too.
Okay.
The leaves on them, they look like the tree is trembling when the wind
Oh,
goes
okay.
through them, and that's supposed to be because they tremble in shame because of what the wood was used for.
Mm.
Now, you know that's not really. It's probably peripheral
Right. Right.
to what we're talking about here in the end, but it illustrates the sort of cultural baggage that these ideas bring along with them.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Garlic, garlic is a blood cleanser, and the ancients knew this long before there were high blood pressure medications and statins for high cholesterol and all
Mm.
that. You know,
Mm.
if you have enough garlic in your diet, it's going to keep a lot of that stuff out of the way, and the ancient peoples knew that.
Mm.
And so, going all the way back to Mesopotamia with things like the Lamashtu and uh,
I better eat more
the
garlic bread then.
Egyptians had,
That's my excuse to eat
had
garlic bread. I'm just kidding.
their own vampires, but they thought that garlic, um, allium sativum, kept evil spirits at bay. And
Oh,
you
okay.
also have to remember that disease and the demonic was tied together in the ancient world, and this doesn't change with Christianity either.
Ah.
Because look at Jesus's ministry. You know, it's a lot of deliverance stuff, but there's often disease, physical disease that's associated.
Right, right. No,
Um,
and yeah, because especially like you said in the ancient world, if you were sick, I mean, it means you're cursed. It didn't mean
yeah,
it didn't mean you like today. If you're sick of whatever, it's just like, oh, that's too bad. But back in the day, I mean, it was automatically attributed to something spiritual, and maybe it was, yeah, a lot of the times. And
certainly.
it would seem so because there was people that were rid of disease when Jesus came along, especially and like focused on that. Like one of the things that I discovered the most about like Jesus, the way he was delivering people and the miracles that he was doing, he was continuing the trend from the Old Testament where he was one upping whatever God was worshipped in that area. You know what I mean? And
Absolutely.
and that was like blowing my mind. Like I think I forgot in what aspect, what study I read, but they attributed possibly him even walking on water to that because of the geographical area, like the cosmic geography of who was in charge of the waters in that area. That it was a different god or something like that, and and him doing that was like a slap in the face to the god, to that specific god. He's like, yeah, okay, you worship him. Well, how about I walk on his face? You know what I mean? It's one of those things, and I
Yeah,
was like,
I mean, yeah, and the Phoenicians, the Syro-Phoenicians that lived in that part of Israel at the time, worship, Baal Hadad, the
mm,
storm god. And so,
mm,
yeah, it's sort of like, what I wrote about, in my dissertation when Jesus visits Caesarea Philippi. I know, Mike Heiser's written about this too, about, when Jesus goes there, he's basically slapping, every unclean spirit in the face there. Not only that, but he takes the title of sons of God away from the watchers.
mm,
He takes their final status as an assembly away from them.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Guys are really messed up. So you're right. He continues that tradition of the prophets and um, holy men of the Old Testament, basically duking it out with the regional deities wherever they were.
Hmm. No, that's super amazing. Do you think? Okay, so we know the Genesis 6 stuff was happening for sure.
Hmm.
There's definitely some, hybrid humans. We got the Nephilim. We got different type. But do you think that like these for example, these lion men of Moab, like, are that's always kind of baffled me. I've heard two different things. Obviously in the more traditional sense is, oh, they were just very brave, men, to representation of that. And in others I heard that they're probably actually, maybe lion like they were not fully human or something, and I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts on that? And then bringing that forward, do you think that some of the modern day cryptozoology experiences, people that, maybe even to the Sasquatch stuff, or the Bigfoot, or even some alien stuff, seem to be very demonic in nature? Uh, does that tie together a little bit? Is there a possibility, you think, that that kind of hybridization is still occurring, maybe through science or something?
I don't think there's any question that it's occurring through science. I mean, we have a whole generation of techno sorcerers who have sort of, taken it upon themselves to not ask any ethical questions about what they're doing because they're being, guided by whatever name you want to give the cabal, the Illuminati, or
Mm,
um, the New World Order, or whatever appellation you want to stick to it.
mm,
We've been doing that for decades,
mm,
um, making these human animal um, hybrids, and I think that some of them have gotten out in some cases, and we see them. In fact, right here in Merkel, Texas, where I'm from, where I live now, I actually wrote a book a number of years ago about the paranormal lore of this area. And one of the stories that I grew up hearing was a variation on a story that was rampant in Texas in the 1960s. It began with a story about the Lake Worth monster. Well, the Lake Worth monster basically looked like Pan, and they began to call him the Goat Man.
ah,
Of course, the Goat Man shows up in the lore of other states too about the same time. But I can remember hearing about Goat Man living here, a Goat Man living here south of town, um, near a creek bed, close to a road named Devil's Backbone, no less.
of
Uh,
course.
but I think that these sort of sightings are ramping up and have been for quite some time um, in the modern age, because that technology, that ability, um, i- is returning to us.
Yeah, and that's what
It's
I was gonna
being
say. It seems that they're going back to what you were saying earlier. They're trying to manipulate, physical
Mhm.
matter through science. And
Yeah.
there's reports that, I mean, very openly, there's a lot of scientists now that are saying, oh yeah, we try and do conjuring, and we try to do, like, what they call, they do microdosing, and they have these, you know um group like experiences together. You know what I mean? And
Mm.
they and I even heard it on Joe Rogan, that he was like mind blown that the same spirit or whatever they were all seeing in their mind was telling every single one of them the same thing as a group in their microdosing trip. You know what I mean? And
Mhm.
you've heard people in Silicon Valley say that they talk to, they try and do these things because they call oversimplify it, like it's not a spiritual thing, like, oh, I have a muse that talks to me, and it gives me information or whatever. um Other people have said that they get these, ideas from extraterrestrials or whatever, and it's like knowledge being given to humans, and them doing something that they weren't able to do before. It's like the oldest story in the book. People don't realize that it I think why people don't freak out about it is that they don't realize that it has biblical origin in the times where God had to destroy the earth because of it. You know what I mean?
Mm. Yeah, and we've reached the point now, that anthropologists used to write about in distinguishing people with Stone Age technologies from more sophisticated technologies, where the difference between magic and high technology doesn't exist.
Mm.
It's 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 all the implementation and use of different kinds of knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I mean, we've entered the quantum age, and if that's not magic by magical definition, I don't know what is, because you know we have half a dozen of these super colliders, notably the CERN one. There's one in Tennessee too, um, and these things are creating artificial singularities,
Mm-hmm.
and we're getting reports from scientists, people that are trained in, you know, observe, experiment, record, repeat, kind of hard science, and they're talking about seeing these entities, showing up uh, at CERN,
Hmm.
coming through these, artificial black holes,
What? What?
and yeah, and the quantum computer. I mean, the whole concept behind a quantum computer is that it actually dumps its questions through things called qubits
Yeah.
into another dimension, and then derives the answer from that dimension, bringing it back to this dimension.
You think that was intentional that they name it like qubits, or that it processes information like a cube, since there's a reference there to like Saturnalia, like Saturn worship and ancient gods and things like that?
Well, the in qubit stands for quantum.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of zeros and ones, um, without getting too abstract, instead of dealing with the binary
Right.
system that's been the construct for computers for this long, the ones and zeros just occupy the same space, but
Right.
different, basically different. Um, what would be the best way to say it? Uh, in micro time, they're
Mm.
occupying the same
Okay. Okay.
space in nanoseconds, if there is such a thing.
Right.
Um, and again, these machines take these, the queries that our computers are based on, dump them into another dimension, and then derive their solutions and answers from another dimension.
Right. And that's like when I remember reading about the quantum technology, and I was pretty fairly new in the Christian world, but I was learning. I was very curious from the beginning, and I'm like, oh, okay, what is this spiritual world? Because it has to be in some way or another. I don't know if it's the right word, but quantifiable. Like it needs to exist in like in this dimension, that dimension. Because I've come to realize, for example, like me, I was made to be able to interact prior to the fall. I'm almost imagining uh being able to interact with the spiritual world like no problem. I think we lost that ability, because of the fall and many other reasons. But uh I don't think we understand that we are both physical and spiritual as human beings. We're not, it's not two separate things where it's like, oh, I'm not in the spiritual world. No, you're part of both, actually. You know what I mean?
Right.
And and
Right.
and so when I'm thinking about the quantum and when we're praying for people, what's in that person is spiritual, but she's having very physical reactions to this demon. You know what I mean? And so it's like it has to in some way or another connect to the physical world. It can't be just this wispy immaterial thing. Like it needs to exist in some way or another. And when I
And it is. I mean, to a degree, that's what I'm trying to do, is to quantify the 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 preternatural.
mm,
Um, I I've really sort of been doing that. When I started using anthropological models to study the biblical giants. Um, sometimes I refer to these demonic manifestations like vampires and werewolves and zombies and ghouls and things like that, revenants that show up
uh-huh.
in folklore, as quantids. If we want to build a taxonomy about them, then they're these multidimensional ancient things that show up in our world, at various points in time and space, over the cultures of the planet.
Mhm.
Um, and if we're to use a modern word, we're in the quantum age. These are both they're matter and energy. They're matter and spirit.
Right, right.
Um, so yeah, you know, our the language of physics was basically first articulated by Sir Isaac Newton,
Mm.
and it's
That
become
makes sense.
we're just now starting to physics is just now starting to catch up with the Bible in terms of um, you know the Bible. The people that wrote the Bible knew about other dimensions. They knew because they talk about it.
Mhm.
They talk about the earth. They talk about the first heaven, the second heaven, the third heaven.
Mhm.
They talk about heaven is another place. Hell is another place. They knew all about multidimensionality. They just used the language that they had at the time to describe it. Well, now not only do we have the language to describe it, but we have the mathematics to quantify it.
Mm.
And it's just slapping us in the face. Um, but I mean, you mentioned vampires or werewolves, to most people, and sadly in the church too. Um, they're not going to want to even talk about it unless it has to do with the Stephanie Meyer book, or something like that.
I'm
Um,
surprised. I'm
because
surprised they
but
allowed
because
me to be the youth leader because when I had a meeting with the pastor of the church, I had a meeting at his house and I felt pretty comfortable. He was asking me some questions and I don't know what happened, but one thing led to another. Next thing you know, I'm talking about UFOs and how they're possibly demonic and just the fringe and just went into the fringe and I was like, "Daggone it, Chuck, keep it together." You know what I mean? But at the end of it, he's like, "Well, you can start next week, start teaching." I'm like, and then I was thinking to myself, like, "Ooh, I don't know how he let me do that," because I was going wild, man.
yeah, well, I mean, so much of this is presented to us in pop culture.
Right.
It's just sort of fed to us, and it's a shame that that in the case of like vampire literature, vampires used to clearly be articulated as the enemy. Well, now they're the heroes and anti-heroes. They're the antagonist of the story. And even that is a facade. You have to strip away the literary or cinematic or television veneer of these things. Take the plastic fangs off, take the makeup off, because at their root they're demonic,
Mm.
and that's something that's very integral to the narrative of the Bible and should be to our walks as Christians.
Yeah, yeah. And well, speaking of, physics barely catching up with the Bible, another ancient thing is, how much the Bible knew about blood and how it was life and how, it
Hmm.
was sustaining and how there's just a very much deeper meaning to blood in the Bible than we think. We just kind of think, oh, just has to do with animal sacrifices, but today,
Yeah.
we have science learning that in a very vampire like way, that blood does the blood of young animals will, like, for example, they did this experiment with rats. We talked about this before where they were injecting an old rat with young rat blood and it was actually
Mhm.
making the other old rat younger. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah. I mean, people that can afford that sort of treatment, they'll get blood transfusions from children,
Yeah. And
and it
I know I know
reinvigorates.
there's cosmetic stuff you can buy, like Sandra Bullock, for
Well,
example.
yeah, and on a sort of, I guess, more microcosmic level, blood doping has a similar effect, that athletes have used.
Mm,
I mean, that's basically how Lance Armstrong, won the Tour de France that time because he got up and he could handle those higher altitudes with more stamina
mm,
because he'd been doing it. These guys falling left and right, huffing and puffing.
mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, I mean, and this illustrates the point that you and I were talking about. Sort of brings us full circle. that there's both a physical component and a supernatural component to blood. And this was universally understood, not just by people who were children of Yahweh and later Christians, but um, by every culture in the world. The sacrality of blood, if you study the history of religions, everybody knew this. It was almost innately known.
Right. I mean, I guess in that sense, it would make even more sense that in order to bring all of creation into restoration, the blood of the creator, would have to
Mhm.
be given to give life back to creation
Yeah,
itself, not just human beings, but the world in its physical matter. Because I mean, the Bible tells us that even the earth as it is now is weeping, right? It's dying, and so it just makes sense to me, that he would that the death of Christ and the resurrection, it goes much deeper than salvation, right? It really goes into the physical aspect of anything that exists. I mean, we're talking plants, animals, we're talking, the earth itself. Like, I mean,
yeah,
just it just makes my mind wander. Like, oh my goodness, like how did
yeah,
this earth look like in Edenic times?
yeah. It's the beginning of the restoration of all creation.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, we're almost on an hour, so do you want to get something in that definitely I didn't ask, and you're like, we always say we're going to talk about this, and then we don't because there's so much to talk about. Like you said, there's on one specific subject, there's volumes, So,
sure.
but I
Well,
definitely
I would go ahead. I'm sorry.
no, I just said I definitely want you to say something, maybe an experience you had, a demonic experience or something incredibly weird or fringy, and if you can, real quick, what are your thoughts on this whole Sasquatch and stuff? I want to talk to somebody about Sasquatch and like the Yetis and all that stuff too, because that stuff it interests me so much, and I just feel like there's definitely a spiritual element to that, especially with people's experiences to it, and so I
Yeah,
just I just can't get a
there
I just can't get a reliable
there are
source.
those that think that it's pure, that it's a biological crypto cryptid. And then you get these reports about them, like popping up out of nowhere and then disappearing into nowhere. And, that all of them seem to be violently territorial wherever they are. Um, they're, they're supposed to smell to high heaven from what I understand.
Yeah,
And I've heard this put forth that they could be a remnant population, related to the tribes of giants.
mm.
Um, that's certainly possible.
You think? Okay, yeah. Well, that's amazing that you bring that up because I'm thinking to myself, like, okay, if they were real, if giants were real, that's one of the arguments that, like, where are they? They're just gone. I'm like, well, have you not heard the biblical stories? You never read them, Didn't you know there was a whole extermination process going on? But which I believe to be what Joshua was doing. It wasn't um just random people that God didn't like or whatever, just because they were sinning.
Yeah, well, I mean, their population diminished because there were, in the wake of the united and divided kingdom periods in Israel's history, they're basically diasporas out of the Holy Land, um, and some of them end up in Europe amongst the Germanic peoples and the Celts. That's where you start. You know, the Greeks and the Romans keep records of encountering them when they fought the Celtic and Germanic tribes. There had to have been a host of them that ended up in the Americas, particularly in Mesoamerica first, because that's when the first civilizations, about the time that the Olmec and the Maya emerged in Mesoamerica, and then the diaspora to the east. You would have seen them going into all the Pacific islands. This is about the time, I think 12th, 13th century is about the time that Angkor Wat is built. You have the Khmer civilization in Southeast Asia,
Mm.
um, which was also bloody. Um, so yeah, I mean,
We got our Native Americans talking about giants too.
Well, that's
And
what I'm saying. I mean, they did end up in the Americas. That they, this would have been part of the contingent that ended up in Mesoamerica, North America, South America.
mm,
Because the civilizations in the Americas emerged later than the ones in the old world did. So far as we can tell, at least post flood, that seems to be the case. But the point that I'm making is that the giants basically keep to their nature wherever they end up. They set themselves up as god kings. They set up these bloody human sacrifice, vampiric religions, and lord it over the people.
yeah, that was a common like story that most of those giants demanded human sacrifice, blood, 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 human sacrifice, blood, blood, blood. So I'm like, oh, there we go. Over and over we're getting this same kind of idea that these giants require that, and I'm wondering if they needed it in order to survive longer, and so they don't die off as soon.
Well, there's no doubt that they consumed human blood. I mean, the pre-flood giants did that. Uh, you know, this it's not just a symbolic act, and that's sort of what we're taught in history is that um, conquering kings, drank the blood of their enemies. Well, yeah, they did, but there was not just ritual purpose behind that. There was actually specific purpose
Yeah, it
behind that.
also reminds me of like some of the occult stories that you hear the Nazis supposedly do, when they were trying to open up portals to beings or whatever. And, you like, for
Yeah.
example, I mean, this is a movie, but like in Hellboy, if you ever watched Hellboy, you know,
Oh yeah.
in the beginning, the first Hellboy, they go to that area where there supposedly is a spiritual portal. They kill one of the guys, and when the blood lands there, the blood opens up the portal, and then we get Hellboy, and we get no. The first they got that evil dude, and then
Hmm.
and then that guy was trying to bring forth Hellboy so that he can do his thing and be like the Antichrist figure type thing that he was going to destroy everything. But again, there's kind of this idea we see in movies all the time. Like one of my favorite movies actually is Pan's Labyrinth, and um, uh, it just struck me so much because it's the first movie I saw of its kind that was in Spanish, and I was blown away that someone made such a really good movie in Spanish like that. And I mean, same thing. In the end, the little girl dies and then goes into the spirit realm and this whole thing. And it was like this just blood sacrifice opening up portals, and there's this ongoing thing with human beings and sacrifice. Oh,
Children.
yeah.
Children.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think there's any last thing I'll ask you and I'll let you go, but I just want to ask someone that has more access to information with scientists and different types of information. You think there's any truth to this whole idea of drinking people's blood when they scare them and they get like this so-called adrenochrome thing, because it blew up
Yeah.
quite a
Yeah.
bit. I know it's in some movies or whatever, and I have actually gone back and seen some of those movies, and like in the latest installment of the second part of The Shining, there's a lot of that talk, and there's definitely human sacrifice in that movie, and they're getting the energy of young children and the psychic energy as well. And I don't know, but I remember someone that was deals with blood saying that blood doesn't work that way as far as like adrenochrome scaring them, and so they can get adrenalized blood. But I don't know. Have you heard anything or researched anything like that?
I don't know that that's even now. Again, I'm not a physical scientist.
Right.
I do have some physical science background, but um, and also grew up in a. My mom is a medical transcriptionist, so I do know a little bit about the way the human body works.
Right.
Um, it depends on how long the child is in the or a person, not even just a child, but it depends on how long they're in that state of fear.
Mm-hmm.
How long your glands are pumping the adrenaline into your bloodstream.
Right.
Uh, because that's how it's getting, that's how you get all these secondary, reactions in your body from the adrenaline. That's why your heart starts pumping. That's why you break out in chills and, all of the sort of secondary, phenotypic reactions that you would have. Um, I think before we could put that into scientific terminology, medical terminology. The ancients obviously knew that, because the farther back you go, they learned it from the people the entities that actually invented it.
Hmm. Yeah, the only reason I ask is because it blew up a lot, especially during the last presidency.
Hmm.
Uh,
Hmm.
in the whole movement, and there was a whole quote unquote red pill movement that just exploded. Everyone was woke. You know what I mean? And there was just that conspiracy just floating around, like, oh, uh, a lot of the royal bloodlines, and a lot of people they're no longer getting their current adrenochrome dose. You know what I mean? And that's why they've aged terribly in the last year or so. You know what I mean? Because they're not they don't have that ability to drink their blood that they're supposedly drinking or whatever. And I didn't even know if that was like physically true. Like, can you adrenalize blood like that and drink it, and does it give you what does it do? You know what I mean? Like, obviously, I hear that
Well,
it's like an amazing high or whatever, but I don't know. So that's why I
yeah,
was.
I think it depends on the amount and the duration that it's pumped into the bloodstream. But even if it's not, you know, like I say, just even a blood transfusion without all of the adrenalized blood has this sort of restorative effect, on older people that get blood transfusions from younger people, let's say.
Yeah, I've seen so much of that stuff happening, which immediately reminds me of your work because I know I'm like, all right, well, there you go, more proof that we're doing today what the ancients used to do back in the day. We're just,
Right.
nothing new under the sun, and I think the more, if anything, this show that I try to do often is connect the little ancient things that happened way back when, and we think they're new today. We're like, oh, scientists discovered this. I'm like, yeah, I heard of that already.
Yeah. Yeah.
BC times, that's been happening, bro. And so more proof, as you say, they're just catching up with the Bible. People are just catching up, and then because they don't do the research, they tend to say that the Bible is outdated and no good, right? But
Right. Yeah. And we need to be careful for the sticks that we grab at, out of this pile, um, because, we still need to think rationally and logically about the supernatural. I like what Mike Heiser says, on Fringe Pop 321. If you've ever seen his show,
yeah,
the
I've seen.
catch line is where we think the world is strange, but your thinking shouldn't be,
Oh yeah,
or your thinking doesn't have to be.
right,
Um, because I mean, there is no doubt there is a supernatural world that we live in, and there are dangers in it. But we also are getting to the point to where we can understand it and quantify it better. Um, and we should, you know, we should still be our discernment should still be very much in place. Our prayerful, discernment, for everybody really, but especially for those of us who are called to think about these matters and try and put them in an understandable kind of taxonomic form. Um, you know, th- there there's a meta picture out
right,
there, and that's really what I'm working on right
good.
now.
And what I like about what you're doing is you're trying to make a lot of this information readily available for folks that want to get it. And that being said, if people really want to dive into anything, like you said in the beginning of the show, you were offering this kind of information so that people can learn from it. And obviously, I believe that if you do take up this information, if you take the time, you'll understand more and more, like we said during the show, how much a big part of the Bible story we are individually in, that we are actually, you know, uh, in the midst of an amazing story, and I think all of this helps because if we make mythology great again, if we make people understand that it's not mythology, that it's not untrue, at least a lot of it, then I think it brings to light our are what we are in that story, right? No, one last thing that I mentioned, I just interviewed Johnny Iron. I'm sure you know who that is, or Johnny from the Iron Show. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and I mentioned something to him because something really stood out to me. And, I sometimes share things to somebody else, and they're even my fellow co-host Omar, and he's kind of like, sometimes I share something with such excitement, and I really expect the same amount of response, and they're just kind of like, whatever, and I'm kind of like, oh, but I shared it with Johnny, and really he really agreed, or at the very least was like never really thought of it. But did you see the movie Glass, like that follow-up movie to
That's
Split?
that's the last in the series to the M. Night Shyamalan movies. Is that right?
Yeah, the
I
one.
didn't. No, I didn't see that, but I used to show the first one, Unbreakable, to
Unbreakable.
my mythology
Oh,
students.
perfect. So I didn't get to see Split. I only saw half of it, and I saw Unbreakable,
Mm-hmm.
and then I saw Glass, and then I saw how he put those two together, and it was just amazing in my opinion. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
I'm giving it too much high praise, but I really liked it. There's a part in the movie. I mean, I guess spoiler, if you haven't seen it, but um,
You,
what was that?
you go ahead. You won't spoil it.
Okay, cool. Um, so there is a lady, that is like a psychiatrist of some sort, and
Mm-hmm.
she's trying to help the character, Bruce Willis's character, that saying that everything he ever experienced in the Unbreakable movie and thus far up until that point was some sort of psychosis. It was made up in his mind. And she was trying to also uh, say that about like other people, like Mr. Glass, the nemesis of this Unbreakable story, and basically convince them that it's all made up in their head. It's not true, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of like ongoing thing throughout the whole movie. And in the end, he almost falls for that story. And but something happens where he really just had to dig deep and use his powers and survive pretty much like the main fight at the end of the movie, the like the epic battle with all the enemies of the movie. And you realize that the enemies of the movie wasn't them with each other, because they were just fighting each other. But the lady comes up towards the end, and she has this little tattoo, and she reveals that she belongs to this secret society, and that they're everywhere. And there's a scene where she
Mm-hmm.
walks into like the restaurant, and everyone, it just seems like a normal scene, but then uh, one person leaves that doesn't belong there, and you realize that everyone in the restaurant was part of this secret society pretending to be customers. And as soon as the people left that weren't part of the clique, they have a little meeting right there in broad daylight in the middle of the day, and nobody knows nothing because it's happening in front of everybody's eyes. And in the end, when she's defeated, because the reason she gets defeated is Bruce Willis uses his powers and believes in himself and becomes the hero he was meant to be. And she kind of frantically asks him, did I convince you though? Did I convince you? Please tell me, did I convince you that you weren't great, that you weren't powerful? And she reveals that that's what the point of that secret society is, that they exist to make those who are great, make them believe that they have no power and that they're not great, you know? And that struck me so much because I felt like, I don't want to say Illuminati, but there's definitely like these powers that be and these people or these entities working to do exactly that with human beings. You know what I mean?
Yep.
To make them just,
Yep.
no, you're nothing, man. You're just, you're stardust. You're lucky to be here. You're just, a product of evolution. You came from monkeys, or you're nothing, man. And and even amongst Christians, when you dilute the Bible and it's really how epic it is and how true it is, it
hmm
also dilutes your part of the story. Like we keep saying, and I feel like
Yeah.
that it just hit me so much. All of that came to mind where I'm like, man, that's exactly right. Like there's a force at work really trying to make you think you're nothing. And even in the Christian story, oh well, you're saved by grace, but you're nothing and you have nothing else to do but be thankful for salvation. For sure, yes, of course. I'm never gonna say not be thankful for that, but that is only the beginning. Now we're part of this restoration process, and now we're part of this kingdom, and we are called to make the kingdom of God bigger, right? We are called to make citizens of this kingdom. And so there's just so much to do. I guess I feel if we understood that, you know what I mean?
Yes, I agree. Yeah,
Yes. Judd Burton agrees.
uh, but when we understand that, I mean, when that's something that God reveals to us over time, our calling, um, that that's really when you begin to start to find your your purpose. You
Mhm,
know,
mhm, mhm.
why you're here. Yeah, yes, to be a citizen, of the kingdom, but um, what is your role? You know, in all of that. Um, and there aren't any small roles in
Mm.
that.
Mhm, mhm.
At the end of the day, that's we're all called to take up our cross.
Yeah.
Um, not so much. I mean, it's a burden, but it's a burden in the way that a samurai would have to oil his sword regularly
Mhm.
and take care of his sword. You know,
Yeah.
it's a burden in the way that a medieval knight would have to know every inch of his horse and not just leave the care of his horse up to his squire
Right.
all the time. Mm, It's a it's a wonderful, wonderful, terrible burden.
Mhm, yeah.
I don't terrible terrible in a severe way, but in a momentous, you know, you know, in a momentous manner. Something that's got a lot of gravitas to it.
Right. And even more amazing that God will for sure capacitate us, uh,
That's well seen. Yeah,
for those things, because you know, uh, I just know that there's many things I would have never been able to take on, but I know that I did. I was there, and then God definitely made it possible through me, and I understand that, it's because of Him. But sometimes we don't realize we're capable of certain things because we see that thing through whatever means who we are, right? And we forget that it's God through us, not just me, right? And then you're just kind of like limit yourself only because you're seeing the task at hand with your eyes and not what God could possibly do through that.
right.
But anything else you want to get off before we land this
Uh,
wonderful plane, man?
yeah. Well, I would on that note, I would just say that God doesn't call the qualified; He qualifies the called.
Yeah, I like that one. Me and my daughter use that a lot. That's one of my favorite
Yeah.
lines.
But if people are interested in delving into this very pertinent and timely material, I would say that's why I came up with this 12 course certification. I've got three of them.
Okay.
There's the preternatural morphology one, which is more subject pertinent to what we talked about today.
Mhm.
There's biblical demonology, and then there's biblical anthropology, which is basically the history and culture with a little bit of language of the biblical world. Getting people to understand the biblical narrative and context is very important. And I also just started um, the first component of a language course in New Testament Greek. So if people are interested, each one of those certifications is on sale right now for $175. So that's 12 courses, month-long courses worth of study that you'd be doing.
Yeah. Well, that's great. And where do they find this? I'm sorry.
Yeah, if people are interested, they can email me at professorburton@yahoo.com, and I'll get them registered that way.
Okay, cool.
Um, the Greek rudiments of New Testament Greek is also on sale for $250, and um, you're not going to get that price at a university or college if you want to
Mhm.
study New Testament Greek.
Yeah,
You're gonna be paying
that's what I was
hundreds of
noticing.
dollars.
Yeah, that's what I was noticing because I'm like, wait, these are like actual college course kind of thing where it's like they're a lot more expensive in real life than what he's offering here. You know what I mean?
Well, that's I mean, I have to pay the bills too, but I'm not. That's why I designed these courses to be affordable. They're academic quality,
Mm,
but they marry faith and scholarship together,
mm.
and give people the benefit, of not just my research but other scholars too.
Right, right. All right, cool. That's great. So, all right. Well, Judd, stick with me. I'm gonna let these folks to listen to some dope music as usual, and we will be right back, folks.